My brother tortured me for 18 years with my parents' permission, but when I discovered they had me just to be his caretaker, I left home. And 6 years later, they called, begging for $15,000 for his legal problems, but I told them no. I'm 25 years old. I work in digital marketing, and I went 6 years without really talking to my parents until they called me like 3 months ago. And when I say they called me, it wasn't to apologize for basically ruining my childhood or to admit that they had me just so I could take care of my brother Dylan when they couldn't anymore. No, they called me because Dylan is in legal trouble and they need money. But anyway, I guess I should start from the beginning, so you understand why when I saw my mom's name on my phone screen after so long, the first thing I thought was, what do they want now? Dylan is 5 years older than me, so that means he's 30 now. And according to my parents, he was always special because he has ADHD. But the truth is, that was never a real excuse for everything he did. You know? My grandparents told me years later that when I was born, Dylan literally tried to hurt me in the hospital. Like he was 5 years old and already showing these signs that things weren't going to be okay. My first memories from childhood are basically Dylan making my life impossible in every way possible that one kid can do to another kid. He would bite me, and I'm not talking about baby bites, but bites that would leave marks for days. He would push me down the stairs. He would take my toys and break them in front of me just to see how I would react. And my parents, well, they basically looked the other way all the time, saying things like, Dylan doesn't understand what he's doing, or he's just frustrated, or he needs more attention. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming when I was like 8 years old, and Dylan pushed me off my bike because according to him I was using his space in the driveway. I scraped up my whole knee and had to go to the doctor to get the wound cleaned. And when we got home, my mom told Dylan not to do that again, but in a tone like, please don't do it again, honey. No real consequences. No punishment. Nothing. Birthdays were the worst. Seriously, every year I hoped that maybe this would be the year things would be different, but no. When I turned 7, my parents threw me a small party in the backyard. There were like 10 kids from my class. We had a piñata and cake and everything, and Dylan showed up in the middle of the party, grabbed the piñata bat and started hitting the table where the cake was. He literally destroyed my birthday cake in front of all my friends. And all my parents did was take him inside and tell the other parents that they were very sorry, that Dylan was going through a difficult phase. I just stood there, looking at the remains of my Spider-Man cake on the floor, thinking, why me? What did I do to deserve this? And none of my friends came back to my house after that. Every year was something similar. A present that Dylan would break. An activity that Dylan would ruin. And my parents always with the same excuse that he couldn't control himself, that we needed to be more understanding. I was hard for him to see me getting attention. But the moment that really broke me, the one that still hurts when I think about it, was when I turned 13. My parents had promised me, and when I say promised, I mean they told me like 5 times that for my 13th birthday we were going to go to Disneyland, just them and me, without Dylan, because he had gone with them the year before when he turned 18, and I had stayed with my grandparents. I was so excited. You know, I had been planning which rides we were going to go on first, what souvenirs I was going to buy with the money my grandparents had given me, and 2 days before the trip, Dylan found out, because I guess he overheard my parents talking about the plans. He threw a massive tantrum, and when I say massive, I mean he threw his entire closet on the floor, broke a mirror, punched a hole in the wall that my parents had to repair later, and was screaming for hours that it wasn't fair that I was going and he wasn't, that he wanted to go, too, that they loved me more than him, which was completely ridiculous considering my whole life had been about Dylan and his needs and his problems. And you know what my parents did? They sat me down in the living room the night before we were supposed to leave and told me that Dylan would be coming with us. That they couldn't leave him like that. That it would be bad for his mental health not to include him. And when I tried to protest, when I told them, but you promised me, this is my birthday, my dad told me something I'll never forget. He said you need to learn to be more mature and understand that your brother has special needs. I was 13 years old, I had just started middle school, and they were asking me to be more mature than my 8-year-old brother. The trip was a nightmare. Dylan complained about everything, about the lines, about the food, about the heat, and at one point he got so angry because I had won a stuffed animal at one of the games that he grabbed it and threw it in. the trash when my parents weren't looking. I spent most of the day trying not to cry and telling myself that it was just a few more years until I could go to college and escape from all this. The following years were more of the same, but escalating more and more. Like Dylan wasn't just pushing me or taking my stuff anymore. Now he was yelling at me that I was useless, that my parents hated me, that I would never accomplish anything in life, and my parents either weren't there when it happened or they would just lock themselves in their room and pretend they didn't hear anything. I focused on school because it was the only thing I could control. I got good grades, I participated in extracurricular activities, anything that would keep me out of the house as long as possible. My grandparents, my mom's parents, they did notice what was happening. Every time I went to visit them, they would ask me how things were at home, and I would always say fine because I didn't want to cause problems. But I think they knew I was lying, because my grandma would always hug me a little tighter before I left. When I was 17 and applying to colleges, I deliberately chose schools that were hours away from home, places where I knew they couldn't just show up or expect me to come every weekend. I applied to a university that was like 8 hours away by car, basically in another state. And when I got accepted, I was so happy. I almost cried. It was my ticket out, my chance to finally live a normal life without having to walk on eggshells all the time. But when I told my parents I had been accepted and that I wanted to go there, they sat me down at the kitchen table, and what they told me that day was probably the most horrible thing they've ever said to me in my entire life. And look, they've said a lot of horrible things. My mom was the one who spoke first. She said, "We need to talk about your future and about Dylan," and I thought, oh great, here we go again. But I had no idea what was coming. They told me that they had been talking to therapists and doctors about what was going to happen with Dylan when they were no longer around, and that the reason they had me, like the literal reason they decided to have another child after Dylan, was so that eventually I could take care of him when they were old or could no longer do it. They told me just like that, so casually, as if it was totally normal to plan your second child specifically to be the caretaker of your first child. And when I just sat there in shock, unable to process what they had just said, my dad added that that's why it was important for me to go to a university nearby, to choose a career that would allow me to have a flexible schedule, to start preparing myself for what was going to be my responsibility in the future. I felt like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water on me. I mean, for years I had wondered why my parents seemed not to care when Dylan treated me badly, why they always put his needs before mine, why they never defended me. And it turns out that all this time I wasn't really their son in the normal sense. I was more like a backup plan, a long-term investment for Dylan's care. I told them no, that I was going to go to whatever university I wanted, that this wasn't my responsibility. And my dad got furious. He started yelling at me that I was selfish, that family takes care of each other, that I didn't understand how hard it had been for them all these years, as if I hadn't lived in that house. As if I hadn't been the one receiving the beatings and the insults and the constant emotional torture. That night I called my grandparents crying. I told them everything, and they told me to come to their house the next day. When I arrived, my grandma already had tea prepared, and they both sat down with me in the dining room, and my grandpa, who was normally a man of few words, told me that they had suspected something like this for years, that they had seen how my parents treated me, and that if I decided to go to that university far away, they would support me financially. Not to worry about the money. I cried so much that day, but this time they were tears of relief because finally, someone was on my side. Someone was telling me I wasn't crazy for wanting to escape, that I wasn't selfish for wanting to live my own life. I told my parents 2 weeks later that I was going to accept the spot at that university and that my grandparents would help me with expenses. The reaction was worse than I expected. My mom cried, saying I was abandoning her, that I was being cruel, that I was leaving Dylan alone. And my dad literally told me that if I left like that, not to count on them for anything, not to expect money, not to expect support, that basically I was choosing to stop being part of the family. Dylan was there when all this happened. He was like 22 at the time. And instead of saying something or defending his parents, he just laughed and said something like, "You always knew you were the second-rate son, didn't you?" I left that house that same day with what I could pack in 2 suitcases. I stayed with my grandparents until classes started, and I didn't talk to my parents again, except for very basic messages like, "I arrived safely at university," or "Merry Christmas." The 4 years of college were probably the best years of my life up to that point. I worked part-time at a coffee shop near campus. I took out student loans to cover what my grandparents couldn't pay. I made real friends for the first time. People who knew nothing about Dylan or my family or all the drama. And I could finally be myself without constantly being in survival mode. I graduated with honors in digital marketing. I got an amazing internship in my last year that turned into a full-time job after graduation. And the first thing I did, when I got my first real paycheck, was start paying back my grandparents for everything they had invested in me. They told me it wasn't necessary, that they had done it gladly. But I insisted because it was important to me to show them that their faith in me hadn't been in vain. During these 6 years, I didn't know much about Dylan except for what my grandparents occasionally mentioned they had heard, like that he was still living with my parents, that he had tried several jobs but never lasted more than a few months, that my parents kept justifying everything, saying it was hard for him to find something that fit his needs. Honestly, I tried not to think much about them. I had made my peace with the fact that that part of my life was closed, that I probably would never have a normal relationship with my family, and I was okay with that because I had built my own life. I had my own apartment, my own friends, my own career, and I was happy, or at least happier than I had ever been living with them. But like 6 months ago, things started to change, although I didn't find out until later. It turns out Dylan had escalated his behavior in a way that even I wouldn't have imagined. And look, I thought I had seen everything with him. Apparently he had started bothering the neighborhood kids, like he would go out to the yard when they were passing by, going to school or playing outside, and he would yell things at them, throw water at them with the hose, chase them a little if they got too close to my parents' house. The neighbors told my parents several times to control Dylan, that the kids were afraid of him. But my parents did what they always did. They said Dylan had problems and that the kids should be more understanding, that it wasn't that bad, that he was just playing. Things exploded when Dylan threw water at a girl who was like 8 years old, who was riding by on her bike with her mom. He completely soaked her and started yelling things about how kids were too noisy and that he hated seeing them there. And it turns out that right at that moment, there was a police patrol car passing by on the street that saw everything. The officers got out, talked to Dylan, talked to the girl's mom, who was obviously upset, and when Dylan started yelling at the police officers too, they basically had no choice but to arrest him. He was charged with harassment of minors. Like there are laws against throwing things at kids and yelling threats. Who would have thought? And since the neighbors gave statements about all the previous times Dylan had done similar things, the case was pretty solid. My parents were desperate. They hired a lawyer who, according to my grandparents, cost them like $5,000 just for the initial consultation. They had to start paying for mandatory therapy for Dylan as part of a pre-trial agreement, plus psychological evaluations, medications. Basically, they were spending all their money trying to keep Dylan out of more serious trouble. And after 6 years of not talking to me, after basically telling me that I had chosen not to be part of the family, they decided it was the perfect time to call me and reconnect. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office finishing a campaign for a client when I saw my mom's name on the screen. For a second, I thought about not answering. It had been so long that it almost felt weird to see her name there, but something made me answer. Maybe curiosity, or maybe some part of me that still had hope. It was a genuine call to apologize or really reconnect. My mom sounded different, like her voice was more tired, and she started by saying they missed me, that they had been thinking about me a lot, that they realized they had made mistakes and that they wanted to fix things. For a moment, I'm not going to lie, I felt something like hope, like maybe they had finally realized all the damage they had done to me. Maybe Dylan had changed. Maybe things could be different. We talked for like 20 minutes about superficial things, my job, my apartment, how my grandparents were doing, and the whole time I was waiting for the moment, when they would say, "I'm sorry," when they would acknowledge what they had put me through, but it didn't come. Instead, my mom started talking about Dylan, about how he had had some problems lately. Nothing serious, of course, according to her, just some misunderstandings with the neighbors, and that they were going through a difficult financial situation because they had to pay for legal help and treatment for Dylan. And that's when I understood everything. They weren't calling me because they missed me or because they wanted to fix our relationship. They were calling me because they needed money. My mom eventually said it directly, asked if I could help them financially. that she knew I had a good job now, that my grandparents had probably left me in a good position, and that as a family we should support each other. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I mean, after all this time, after basically admitting they had me just to take care of Dylan, after cutting me off completely, when I decided to live my own life, now they wanted me to rescue them financially. I told them no, that I wasn't going to give them money for Dylan's problems, that I had built my life without their help and that I had no obligation to help them now. And my mom started crying, saying I was still selfish, that I was still putting my needs before those of the family, exactly the same speech they had given me when I was 17. I hung up the phone trembling, not from sadness but from rage, because even after 6 years, even after everything I had accomplished on my own, they still saw me the same way, as a resource, as someone who existed only to serve Dylan and his needs. I called my grandparents that night and told them everything, and my grandpa, who by that time was like 75 years old, told me something I'll never forget. He said that choosing to walk away from toxic people, even if it's your family, doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you a wise person. He told me that he and my grandma had seen how my parents treated me for years and that they felt guilty for not having intervened more, but that they were proud of the person I had become, despite everything. The next 2 months were weird. My parents called me like 3 more times, each time with a different reason why they needed money. Legal costs were increasing, Dylan needed more expensive medications, they had to pay for specialized therapy, and each time I told them no. The last time they called it was my dad who spoke, and it was probably the most honest conversation we had had in years, although not in a good way. I told him directly that everything they had done to me, all the abuse they had allowed Dylan to do to me, all the emotional neglect, everything had been their decision, that I had been a child who hadn't asked for any of that, and that it wasn't my responsibility to fix the consequences of their decisions now. My dad tried to argue, said they had done the best they could, that it was hard to raise a child with special needs, that I didn't understand the pressure they had been under all this time, and I simply told him that maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't fully understand how hard it had been for them, but what I did understand perfectly was how hard it had been for me, how alone I had felt, how scared I was all the time, and that those experiences mattered as much as theirs, if not more, because I was the child in the situation. There was a long silence after that, and then my dad just said he hoped that someday I could forgive them, and hung up. From what I know through my grandparents, Dylan's case eventually reached a settlement. He had to do supervised community service, mandatory counseling for a year, and my parents had to pay a pretty hefty fine, I think like $8,000 or something like that. The parents of some of the kids Dylan had harassed got restraining orders, so basically now Dylan can't be near parks or schools or places where there are children, which is probably good for everyone. My parents still live in the same house. Dylan still lives with them because obviously he can't live alone, and apparently things are more or less the same except now they have less money and more legal stress. I've maintained minimal contact with my parents since then. I send them a message at Christmas and on their birthdays, basic things like, "Have a good day." But there are no real conversations, no video calls. I haven't gone to visit them and they haven't come to see me. Some people have told me I'm too hard, that I should give them another chance, that in the end they're my family. But the truth is I've learned that family isn't just blood. Family is the people who support you, who protect you, who want the best for you, and my parents were never that for me. My grandparents, they are my family. My close friends I met in college, who have been there for me in difficult times. They are my family. But my parents and Dylan, they're just people I share DNA with. As for Dylan, I haven't spoken to him even once in these 6 years, and honestly I have no plans to do so. I don't wish him anything bad. Seriously, I hope the counseling helps him, that maybe he finds some way to be a better person. But that's not my problem or my responsibility. I spent the first 18 years of my life being his victim. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being his savior or his caretaker or whatever my parents planned for me to be. Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if my parents had made different decisions, if they had sought real help for Dylan from the beginning instead of just justifying his behavior, if they had protected me instead of sacrificing me for him. But then I realize it doesn't make sense to think about those what-ifs because I can't change the past. I can only control my present and my future. And my present is pretty good. Actually, I have a job I like, a small but nice apartment in a city I love, friends who really care about me, and a close relationship with my grandparents who have given me more love and support in 6 years than my parents gave me in 18. Last week, my grandma asked me if I would ever forgive my parents, and I told her that honestly I didn't know, that maybe someday, but that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or going back to having the same relationship, that you can forgive someone for your own peace of mind and still choose to keep distance from them. I think that's where I am now, trying to let go of the resentment not because my parents deserve it, but because I deserve to live without that burden. But that doesn't mean I'm going to trust them again, or let them be part of my life in a meaningful way. I set my boundaries. I stood firm when they tried to manipulate me into helping them financially, and although it was hard, and although there were moments when I doubted if I was doing the right thing, now I know I was. At the end of the day, I think we all have to make decisions about what kind of relationships we want to have in our lives, and I decided I prefer to have few relationships but healthy ones than to have many relationships but toxic ones. My parents and Dylan may or may not understand that. Honestly, I don't care much if they understand it or not, because this decision isn't about them, it's about me, and about protecting the peace and stability that cost me so much to build after years of chaos and abuse. I don't regret leaving when I was 18. I don't regret saying no when they asked me for money, and I don't regret keeping my distance now. If that makes me selfish in their eyes, well, I guess I can live with that.